Today, September 7th, we are going to cover Volume 2, Chapter 5, and we are going to be looking at Agni today. So, as usual for our Saturday classes, we're going to do this in 2 blocks. We're going to go for about 2 hours for our first block, cover the first half of the chapter, and then we'll take like a 20-minute break, and then we will come back for the second block and cover the second half of the chapter. We'll probably wrap it up a few minutes before 12 o'clock, like we did last week. So, be ready with your questions. If you have any questions for the first half and the second half of Chapter 5, and we can address those as we go through. We can start off with any questions that anybody might have from Chapter 4. Does anybody have any Chapter 4 questions?
I have a couple of questions.
Great.
The clock, in the last page, 94, is that applied to our clock, because the sunset, sunrise varies from summer to winter drastically here.
Right.
So, or are you going to elaborate later on?
That's a great question. We are going to talk about that in a lot more detail later, but just I'll give you a quick overview of what it means. So when we're looking at the doshas, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha, and how these go through their cycles of increase and decrease, these cycles happen on not only an annual basis in terms of the seasons, which is what people may be most familiar with, but these also happen in any other situation as well. So day-to-day basis, day and night, stages of life, and even as we're going to see in Chapter 5, after eating a meal, so stages of digestion. And what this is supposed to mean is that we should always be on the lookout for how these doshas present themselves at any given point in time. We may not be restricted only to this list. Keep that in mind. There may be other scenarios where we can find Vata, Pitta, and Kapha going through cycles that are outside of what is explicitly listed here. So try to take these as indicators of examples. Using these very common examples, we can easily come to understand how we see the doshas in that type of capacity, and then we can take that knowledge and try to reapply it or look for it in other places in life as well. So when we look at the day and the night cycles, the easiest way to do this is to just first envision a clock and say it's 12 o'clock up here, 6 o'clock down here, 3 o'clock here, and 9 o'clock here. What happens is that there are transition points. In the northern hemisphere, the further north or south we go towards the poles, our sunrise and sunset times are going to vary much more so than they will at the equator. Keep in mind, of course, all of this information that's in the classical text is written in the context of the Indian subcontinent. The tip of the Indian subcontinent is something like 5 or 8 degrees north latitude. It is very close to the equator. There is very little deviation in day and night time periods. However, as you go further north and you end up in places like Kashmir or Leh or Ladakh, the very highest northern reaches of the Indian subcontinent, there's a lot more variation. I believe they're up somewhere around 20-25 degrees north latitude. And so we can find that in places like the southern tip of Florida, subtropical regions. There will be a larger variance there. So whenever we do have sunrise to sunset, that is where we want to demarcate these time fluctuations. So in addition to these fluctuating with Vata, Pitta, and Kapha, there's also going to be a proportion that fluctuates for each of these throughout the year. So when we get into summertime and the day is much longer, where Pitta shows up in the middle of the day, we're going to have a longer period of that. versus wintertime, where the daytime is shorter and the nighttime is longer. We're going to have longer proportional periods of Vata and Kapha in the wintertime, for example. This lines up perfectly with the way that Ayurveda explains annual cycles. These annual cycles are the kalas. So kalas, we have two, Adana Kala and Visarga Kala. And while we've started to talk about these just a little bit, we will see these a lot more in Volume 3. So just keep the names in mind for now if you can. And let's just look at a kind of a straight example of where these times split up. So approximately between 10 and 2, and 2 to 6, and then 6 to 10. These are our approximate splits for the doshas in a day and night cycle. So 10 to 2 is the middle of the day or night, and that's where we have Pitta. 2 to 6 is the end of the day or the end of the night. That's where we see Vata. And 6 to 10 is, of course, the beginning of the day or the beginning of the night, and that is where we tend to see Kapha. Does that make sense? So as the
Yes.
Great. As the day and sunrise and sunset times fluctuate over the course of the year, this marker here may move forward or back just a bit.
So Jeff, the suggestion of waking up before sunrise, also the timing would change according to the season, correct?
It sure would. And so, in northern latitudes where the sun comes up at 4:30 in the morning, does that mean everybody should be waking up at 4 o'clock every day? Well, it's kind of a complicated question to answer because, again, this is outside of the purview of the Indian subcontinent, but the answer could be yes, and it probably is yes. And one thing that we can account for is that in the summertime, when the days are so long and the nights are very short, the summertime is the only time in the year where naps are allowed on a day-to-day basis. So that short amount of sleep can be compensated by a nap in the afternoon in the summertime if a person chooses to follow that type of schedule. Great question, Kieran. Do you have any more?
One more on the kapha. You gave the example. You gave order of importance for the other two, and I forgot to write for the kapha. Guna.
Okay, I see. So kapha gunas, guru, shita, and snigdha are going to be the three most important ones, and we can see that again by the fact that all authors have recognized these three gunas. We also do have Pittila mentioned by all authors, so that should qualify under that way of thinking.
I get it now. Okay, all of them agree. So
Exactly.
Thanks.
Sure. One interesting thing that I want everybody to note, and keep in mind that you're not going to understand this right now, but notice how in these doshas, especially for kapha, Sushruta and Bhava have mentioned lavana as an indicator of kapha, and Sushruta specifically says that lavana is present as a guna of kapha when kapha is in a vaikrita state. So SA 2019 folks, you guys should have a much better idea or be able to elaborate much more effectively on what this is going to mean at this point. SA 2020 folks, I want you to just notice these things, highlight them, and tuck them away somewhere so that you can remember them for later. Bhava Prakasha mentions Vidagda in a similar context, and Vidagda refers to sort of a misfired digestive process. So Dagda is something which is burnt, and Vidagda is kind of like it's burnt in a specific way which is not really the right way. It's deviated from its normal state, so it's not proper. it's not healthy. It's an indicator of kapha being in a Vikrita state. And I thought, yeah, and so kapha is the dosha that gets the flavor, that's indicated with rasa. Pitta is the dosha which is then indicated with color and smell, okay? And vata is the dosha which is indicated by movement, primarily, activity, or lack of activity. Remember that difference that we saw with Sushruta not mentioning Chalaguna, but instead mentioning Vishtamba. So the lack of movement for vata dosha would be an indicator of some type of Vikrita state as well, most likely, because vata is predominantly responsible for movement. The lack of movement or ceasing of movement would indicate that vata dosha is not functioning in its normal state. Okay, any other questions for chapter 4? Alright, so then let us move on to chapter 5. Everybody's okay with chapter 4 homework? No answer means yes. Alright, so let's get started on chapter 5, and this is one of